I'm joined today by Dr. Leonard Cruz, who's editor-in-chief of Chiron Publications and is also co-founder of the Asheville Jung Center. He's a Cuban-American writer, editor, and psychiatrist, as well as co-author of DSM-5 Insanely Simplified. We are talking today about the book A Clear and Present Danger, Narcissism in the Era of Donald Trump, a very, very relevant issue, Dr. Cruz. So let's start at the very beginning. Sometimes people get confused between many of these terms, sociopathy, psychopathy, narcissism, etc. What are we talking about when we're talking about narcissism?
Well, thanks first for having us on. Narcissism is everything that spans from the normal realm of the healthy aspects that allow us to become invested in ourselves and develop a normal, healthy sense of self, all the way into the realm of the pathologic, which at its worst becomes what clinically is referred to as narcissistic personality disorder, and that being a condition in which the features of the narcissism become fairly fixed, immutable. They impose themselves in all sorts of dimensions of an individual's life.
Is narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder, is this something that the consensus is this is something that is a result of environment, or is it something that is a result of genetics or heredity?
There's no real consensus on the matter. I think what you could fairly say is that under certain circumstances, if a person's wounds in childhood and in their developmental years are of a particular nature, one of the compensatory reactions might be the development of narcissistic inflation. So whether that's also influenced by genetics, hard to say, but more often than not, I think the opinion would be that it's the environment that shapes the individual, and that narcissism in some respects is kind of a compensation that ends up becoming of rather huge distortion. Like I said earlier, though, David, remember, narcissism by itself, in terms of psychological jargon, is part of the normal development. We all start off completely self-absorbed, and as we go through life, hopefully, the presence of others in our life become increasingly more important and become a part of our weave.
So with regard to Donald Trump, the president-elect now, talk to us about the analysis and evaluation that you did in relation to narcissism and sort of what you believe to be the case, the connection between narcissism and Donald Trump.
You know, there is a lot of discussion on the subject of how do we explain the phenomenon of this individual who's risen to the presidency, and also maybe some equal amount of interest in how do we explain the response that he evoked in the electorate. And I want to kind of footnote, although it's throughout the book, I think it's important to even footnote here on the program that it isn't really our intention or expectation that we're diagnosing somebody from afar. In fact, the American Psychiatric Association, because of an incident back in the Goldwater period, promulgated a rule that for all intent and purposes discourages and all but forbids the diagnosis of somebody that you've never laid eyes on and had an interaction with.
Okay, I'm glad you're mentioning that. If you didn't mention it, I was going to next, so I'm glad we got that out of the way, yeah.
Yes, but you know, that aside, I think it's not unreasonable to suppose that everybody is trying to opine and figure out how do we explain this individual, his behavior, the characteristics that we see. So with that in mind, I don't know that there's a consensus that this individual has narcissistic personality disorder. I think there's been an appropriate amount of reserve from clinicians not wanting to breach that divide and make the diagnosis. But I think even by Donald Trump's own admission, he was quoted in a book, in response to a book written by an analyst from Washington who actually was describing the productive narcissist. And Donald Trump, by his own words, kind of assigns the label to himself that he thinks he's a productive narcissist. So that, combined with a whole lot of other things that have issued forth from Donald Trump, I think certainly raised the specter of that phenomenon. And then, of course, the question I think is just as equally interesting is what kind of response does an individual with narcissistic personality traits evoke in others? And in this case, how did he do that in a very large, broad, collective capacity.
Yeah, so let's address that. I mean, what elements, when we think of the ways in which Donald Trump appealed to different elements of the electorate that ultimately saw him winning the electoral vote by as a result of 80,000 votes in 3 particular states, what was it about Donald Trump's public persona that may have appealed to others in a way that's relevant to the narcissism analysis?
You know, one of the things that I found perhaps the most compelling was during the lead up to his nomination, when we were watching the all 17 candidates on stage at once. There was this one of the debates, I don't remember which one in particular where it was held, but I remember distinctly it was the one in which he began name calling various different candidates. He called Marco Rubio Little Marco, and Donald Trump he ridiculed, Jeb Bush he ridiculed for his kind of energetic, apathetic, kind of weakened state.
Low energy.
And yeah, low energy Jeb, right? Or Lion Ted. You know, you had a moniker for everybody. You know, the thing I was really struck by on that one, David, was that everybody I've known, and all men that I've known, have in one way or another encountered a bully. You know, when you were growing up, you either were the subject of a bully, you were perhaps the bully yourself, or you were witness to the bully and not sure exactly how to engage. And I watched that scene and I was powerfully struck by the fact that here was this presidential candidate who was basically tapping into something that is probably very primal and present in all of us, that we've all been treated by the bully in one fashion or another, whether we had to align with him to avoid our own skin getting scorched, or whether we were the bully. And, you know, it was interesting to watch these very competent individuals not standing their ground to the bully, same way you might have watched on a playground. So I mentioned that as a footnote because in trying to figure out what did he tap into collectively, some people, at least in the book, argued, and I think there's some merit to this, that there has been over the last, depending on when you want to mark the starting point, a sort of loss of esteem, loss of power, loss of a sense of privilege. You know, we've heard a lot of that bantered around, whether it was just white, uneducated males. We saw clearly that he tapped into something beyond that. But there was a collective sense that we as a nation, we as people perhaps who enjoyed some privilege, have seen that receding. And I think he combined that with this skillful ability to promise things that most of us understood were improbable or impossible to achieve, but somehow you felt like your own wounds have been healed. So I think there's something about that fact that all of us have felt wounded at some level, whether it was personally on a playground or collectively when you see the Twin Towers go down or you see our defeat in Vietnam. And he managed to tap into that. And then I think, like many people who have demagogic qualities do, he had an amazing ability to promise the moon, which we're already seeing him backing up from.
When we think about these narcissistic tendencies or personality traits in the context of being president and making decisions that a president makes, what's your sense of what the interplay there might be? In what way might these tendencies impact how someone is as president of the United States?
My biggest fear, and I think one of the purposes that we had behind writing the book and compiling the different perspectives that the authors and contributors had, was this was more than just illuminating the field about Donald Trump the person. This was also hoping to shed some light on the very phenomenon of narcissism, whether you encounter it in your workplace because you're working for somebody who's got narcissistic traits, whether you're married to somebody who's narcissistic, or whether you're being led as a nation by somebody. So that was really one of the underlying intents. And my biggest concern with that idea in mind is for the narcissistic individual, there is a very blurred boundary between the sense of the other and themselves. I mean, to a certain extent, the people who have narcissistic personality disorder, you could almost understand it as they treat individuals and others around them in the same way you would an inanimate object. If I have a pen that is a precious and valued pen and it suddenly runs out of ink, I really have no use for it anymore, and I treat it with kind of disdain and disregard. And I think one of the dangers that I think awaits people who have narcissistic traits when they're imbued with political power, is that provided somebody has something that they need, they may very well esteem them, they may very well overesteem them. The moment that ceases to be the case, they may cast them aside, treat them dismissively, and even worse, treat them scornfully. And I think we've seen some evidence that when President-elect Trump deals with the media, it really depends in large measure how he's feeling at that moment in time as to whether he regales the media or he scorns them. Mostly it's been scornful.
Yeah, and I think the other example would be people that are friendly to Trump are just the best people in the world, and people who maybe once were friendly but are no longer are really just fundamentally terrible people. And we've seen that happen time and again in terms of the people Trump associates with. Very, very interesting. Again, the book is A Clear and Present Danger: Narcissism in the Era of Donald Trump. We've been speaking with the book's co-author, Dr. Leonard Cruz. Thanks so much for talking to us about this.
Oh, you're very welcome, David. Thank you for having us on.